welcome to Integrate Online, presented by West Virginia University Reed College of Media, which offers renowned online master's degree programs in marketing communications. I'm Jerry Wood, the director of the Center for Veteran, Military, and Family Programs at West Virginia University. And I want to thank you all for joining us today as we'll be discussing combating disinformation during COVID-19 with our special guests, Colonel Mike Jackson, who's having a few technical difficulties, but hopefully will be joining us soon, and Lieutenant Colonel Brian Fickel, who serves as an Army Public Affairs Officer and is currently a student at the National War College in Carlisle. If you have questions or comments, feel free to chat those out to us. We are monitoring and we'll be responding as we can. As you all know, the COVID-19 has created a surge in content creation and saturation of the media. And with consumers constantly being bombarded with headlines and updates, it can be difficult to spot what is authentic and true and what is fabricated. So today, with the expertise of our guests, they're going to help us with their perspective when it comes from the military point of view. So Brian, welcome. And again, when Mike joins in, we'll get him up and running. So Brian, if you'd like, please share a little bit about yourself and what you do as a public affairs officer.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thanks everyone for being here today. Feel free to comments in the chat, throw your comments up in the chat. I can see them there. So I'm Lieutenant Colonel Brian Fickel, Army Public Affairs Officer, studying at the U.S. Army War College, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. My background is in information-related things. I've been studying information warfare while I'm at the War College, and I really got interested in this in a previous assignment when I was working at U.S. Central Command in Florida, which is responsible for our operations in the Middle East, primarily Iraq, Afghanistan, and other neighboring countries. And so I was there in 2013, 2016 when we were fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and I stumbled into Russian disinformation. So Russia entered into the fight in 2014, 2015, and they began giving us a lot of problems with disinformation. They would give us credit for their civilian casualties when they conducted bombing raids and things like that. And I quickly discovered that we were not good at countering disinformation. So that led to my studies here at the War College on disinformation in general, but specifically looking at Russia and China, who are our principal adversaries in our national defense strategy documents. So just a quick overview on disinformation, and then I'll go into the coronavirus disinformation environment specifically. I'll talk a little bit about how Russia and China are each approaching it, and then I'll offer some, I'll kind of go over the main narratives that we're seeing that are disinformation, and then I'll talk about what the media companies are doing about it, and then I'll go into some kind of best practices and tips for countering disinformation, and I'll give you a few resources. So that's kind of the approach we'll take. Feel free to comment or throw questions up at any time, and then we'll get to those after I provide kind of the basis. So disinformation is nothing new. Russia has been very good at disinformation, and many of you may know or may not know, back in 1983, there was a significant disinformation campaign, which was called Operation Infection. It was run by the KGB, and it was it made claims in a New Delhi newspaper that the AIDS virus was invented at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and that narrative took hold very well, and to the point where we're seeing that kind of disinformation even today. The World Health Organization has labeled the COVID-19 outbreak an infodemic because of the amount of disinformation we're seeing. The definition for disinformation that I'll use today is false information which is intended to mislead, especially propaganda issued by a government organization to a rival power of the media. And the short descriptor of this is basically the more authoritarian the government of a country is, the more information and disinformation are used. And I break it down into two basic approaches by these governments. They take an internal approach and an external approach. Internally, they manipulate perceptions within its own country in order to shape outcomes favorable to the government leaders. We see this very clearly in China, where the Chinese Communist Party has virtually perfected the control of internal information. It's very heavily surveilled country using facial recognition technology and requiring by law that a certain app is installed on users' phones so that they can monitor their social activity. And all of this leads to an actual social credit score that China gives its citizens. And the higher the score, the more things that they can do, the more freedoms and liberties they have, basically. The second approach is an external approach. Information and disinformation campaigns are directed at adversaries and other countries in an effort to protect or improve their own international position, or to actually deceive other countries for some short-term benefit. And we've seen this many times with Russia. Most recently, or most famously maybe, is the election meddling in 2016. Militarily, their use of what we called little green men to annex Crimea. So they basically used Russian paramilitary to force their way into a portion of Crimea. They disavowed that they were tied to Russia until it was a fait accompli. They basically took the area and held it, and now it's actually annexed to Russia. Ultimately, the point is to the point with disinformation is to muddle the truth, cast suspicion on everything, and more specifically, from my perspective, is to weaken the American politic with doubt and despair. It's a means of attack that can be used that's just as debilitating as the virus. Social science studies have shown that when people feel a lack of control over their own personal lives, such as what we're feeling right now, that they are more susceptible to conspiracy theories and more likely to become vectors of disinformation themselves. So that gets into misinformation. People with good intentions that fall victim to disinformation then spread that disinformation themselves, believing it to be true. So specifically, let's move to the coronavirus disinformation environment, and I'll talk about that and talk about the big narratives that we're seeing and the approaches that these countries are taking. Coronavirus disinformation is really falling into two categories. One is it's fiction about its origins, and two, it's falsehoods about the cures. So we're seeing theories about where it came from, and we're seeing theories about cures, and these are all rife with disinformation. NewsGuard is an organization that rates news sources, and they've identified 140 sites that are publishing false information or hoaxes about the virus. Recently, a couple weeks ago, a European Union document was released, found that Russia's state-controlled media has used the public health crisis to undertake an ambitious disinformation campaign in the West, whose goal is to sow the seeds of panic and distrust. In Washington, a senior State Department official told Congress that bogus online accounts, websites, and traditional media outlets, all under the authority of Russia, have leveraged deepening fears of the pandemic, quote, to try to advance their priorities. And China has been aggressive in their disinformation approach as well. It's pretty amazing to see that the spokesman for China's foreign ministry actually come out in tweets to cast doubt on the facts of the virus originating in China, and suggesting that it was actually introduced by the United States Army. So to actually see a state actor, a person paid by the government as a foreign ministry official, to come out publicly to say that is pretty surprising. So some of the current trending false narratives we're seeing, and I'm going to list these as quickly as I can. One, the coronavirus is a biological weapon deployed alternatively by China, the US, the UK, or Russia, with the aim of destroying the EU or NATO. The coronavirus did not break out in Wuhan, China, that the US is concealing its true origin, which is in fact the US or US owned labs across the world. The outbreak has been caused by migrants, and migrants are spreading the virus through the EU. The coronavirus is linked to the 5G network. The EU has failed to handle the crisis. It's a disaster for Europe. China is coming to the rescue of Europe as the European Union has abandoned its members. The coronavirus is a hoax. It does not exist. And some with the cure is the claims that natural remedies exist to cure the virus, which are often combined with anti-vaccination narratives. And then there's many other miscellaneous conspiracy theories, historical predictions about the pandemic, plagues hitting the planet, secret deep state attempts to control population growth, and even that the pandemic may be caused by chemtrails or lead to World War III. So there are many false narratives that are out there. And if you go back to the original overview of disinformation, the goal for some, especially Russia, is just to sow confusion, just to confuse. And for a country like China, it's very helpful for people to believe some of these other theories, or even if they don't believe them, just to be confused about what the truth is. So the two principal adversaries for the United States, militarily and otherwise, are Russia and China. This is well established in our national defense literature. Russia has been an expert at disinformation campaigns, historically speaking. They're very good at it, and some have used the term the Gerasimov doctrine. I'm not going to use that term. It's loaded with a lot of debate about whether or not there is a Gerasimov doctrine, but Gerasimov is a general in the Russian army who basically took an approach of total competition against other states. So, from Russia's perspective, they're in competition or even conflict with the United States now, and we don't view it that way, but they do. So they see all measures are on the table or available to them, and information has been a historical weapon that they've used. I talked about Operation Infection, the 1983 example. During the Cold War, we had an executive agency that was responsible for our information competition with Russia. It was the United States Information Agency. That does not exist now. After the wall came down and the USSR disintegrated, we basically cut apart the USIA and piecemealed it off the different executive agencies, but it doesn't exist today. So we don't have an executive agent at the national government level that's combating Russian disinformation, which is a challenge. But what we've seen with Russia pro-Kremlin media, they have mounted a significant disinformation campaign specific to the coronavirus pandemic crisis in Western countries, and they're doing that by destroying confidence in the emergency response. The efforts are aimed to stoke confusion, panic, and fear to stop people from obtaining good information about the contagion as part of a broader strategy to subvert European and Western societies from within. Russian state-linked false personas and accounts on social media that have previously posted on subjects including Syria and other issues are now pushing disinformation about the coronavirus in English, Spanish, Italian, German, and French. And these messages are characteristic of Russia's well-established strategy of using disinformation to amplify divisions, sow distrust and chaos, exacerbate crisis situations, and issues of public concern. RT, which is Russia Today, which you can stream on any device, and many cable networks in the United States carry it today, which is heavily financed by the government of Russia. Anyway, RT Spanish version is among the top 20 most engaged with sources online when it comes to coronavirus related information. So they dominate the information landscape for the Spanish speaking. Internally, messages targeting domestic Russian audiences describe the virus as a form of foreign aggression. claiming that the coronavirus originated in secret US or Western labs. And they emphasize the challenges coping with the virus mainly affecting foreign and democratic countries while Russia is fighting the outbreak. Externally, messages targeting international audiences in those languages I mentioned are following a different approach. They're focusing primarily on conspiracy theories about global elites deliberately weaponizing or exploiting the virus for their own ends. And here the aim is to induce distrust in national authorities and healthcare systems in Western and democratic nations. So pivoting over to China, where Russia has the Gerasimov doctrine, which is kind of using all implements to compete simultaneously, and that they're in competition with now. With China, the dominant approach is what they call the three warfares. It's also called unrestricted warfare. There's a great book called Unrestricted Warfare on this topic, but it's the three warfares approach, and it really came to be around 2003. In China, the People's Liberation Army is a major player in the three warfares approach, and it's considered the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. So the purpose of the PLA, the primary purpose of the PLA is to secure the Chinese Communist Party, whereas we look at the U.S. Army as protecting the Constitution of the United States and our freedoms. The three warfare strategy is talks about attacking public opinion. So it's public opinion warfare, it's psychological warfare, and it's legal warfare. And with legal warfare, I would call it influence warfare. It's the Chinese Communist Party using all measures of its influence in a legal way to influence outcomes. So creating political power is precisely what three warfares is about. The first of the three warfares, media or public opinion warfare, attempts to shape public opinion domestically and internationally. If the domestic element sounds odd, it's because the PLA believes energizing or mobilizing the Chinese public is useful for signaling resolve and deterring foreign incursions on Chinese interests. The second warfare attempts to influence foreign decision makers and how they approach Chinese policy or China policy. And the third seeks to shape legal context for Chinese actions, including building the legal justification for Beijing's actions and using domestic laws to signal Chinese intentions. Bottom line is the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, seeks to influence the outside world, especially the United States, primarily to preserve the power of the party. So we've seen with China with COVID-19, they've set up multiple fake bot accounts on Twitter, and they're using Radio Free Asia's logo, which is our logo, using Radio Free Asia's logo and descriptions to tweet fake news in recent months, including allegations that the coronavirus came from the United States. The tweets are sent out by accounts using the Radio Free Asia logo but it's named after various regions in China. For example, Radio Free Guangdong, Radio Free Anhui, and they turn out tweets that reflect the official line of the ruling Chinese Communist Party, including the rumor that the coronavirus pandemic originated in the United States and not in central China, city of Wuhan. ProPublica, which is a public interest journalism website, tracked more than 10,000 suspected fake Twitter accounts since August 2019 that have been part of a coordinated influence campaign with ties to the Chinese government. I'd like to keep moving on. Some of the main Chinese narratives include China and especially Xi Jinping have done an admirable job of containing the virus. The West, and especially the United States, should be grateful to China for their quick reaction, that the virus did not originate in China. The West instrumentalized the virus in order to harm China and spread anti-Chinese sentiment. China's provision of medical equipment, technology, and expertise is perceived by several neighboring states as far outstripping Western donors. China is positioning itself as the partner of choice in the battle against the virus, especially with European countries and many others. Briefly, even ISIS is getting involved in the coronavirus disinformation game. They've been exploiting trending hashtags, including the ones for coronavirus, to spread their own messages for their own purposes. The coronavirus has been used to foment hate speech and fuel tensions between Sunni and Shia Muslims in the region. And the outbreak has even been used against Iran to spread anti-Iran sentiments, claiming that the coronavirus is an aggressive attack by Iran that turned the virus into a political tool. So the disinformation environment for coronavirus is the most aggressive I've seen in recent history. What are the social media companies doing about it? Google, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft have all declared that they're working with national health authorities as well as the World Health Organization to promote authoritative content and make it more accessible to users. On the 16th of March, all the major companies issued a joint statement announcing that they're working closely together to combat coronavirus disinformation. And you've probably seen it. You've probably seen it in your Facebook when you go in there. You see a big banner for COVID-19 Information Center. All the major companies are doing similar things. So I want to wrap this up because I would really like to see some questions. I see some popping in there. Basically, disinformation is an asymmetric weapon with no barrier to entry. There are countries, authoritarian nations that are taking full advantage of it, but really the barrier to entry is minimal. Anyone can create a disinformation campaign. And with COVID-19, it's the perfect environment for disinformation. The short version of what to do about it is you have to maintain social distance from disinformation. You have to practice good information hygiene. You gotta refuse the traffic and conspiracy theories, and you have to be skeptical of what you're reading, what you're consuming. You have to trust data, not belief, and you have to inspect every claim that you see. Most people look at an approach for combating disinformation is really information literacy, and it really starts at a national level. We have to be good about teaching our citizens how to be good about consuming information. And studies show that actually our younger generations are much more skeptical of the source of information than our older generations, which I find hopeful. Some tips for some resources. I don't endorse any of these. Everything I've said is my personal opinion, not the position of the Department of Defense. But some good websites, and I'm actually going to post them in the comments instead of read them and try to have you guys type them down. But these are some good resources. StopFake.org is a tremendous resource. If you want to look at defense.gov, the Pentagon has set up a specific rumor control splash page specific to the coronavirus. Another one that just came out today, and I haven't had a chance to go through it, is datajournalism.com put out a brand new handbook this morning that's supposed to help journalists. NewsGuardTech.com, I mentioned that earlier. They have very good ratings for sources of information. They have a coronavirus page specifically, and they list a long list of websites that are pushing fake information. So if you want to check a resource for something specific to COVID, go to NewsGuard Tech. There's a link on their main page that will give you a list of websites. And then ProPublica.org is a nonprofit organization that works in this field. So with that, I'm going to move to the questions in the comments, but feel free to speak up if you'd like. So the comment by Eric, I think it was an Army reservist who was targeted. That's correct. There was a female Army reservist who was participating in athletic games in China in the fall. She got a concussion during her bike race and had some health complications associated with that. And there's actually national coverage of her now, I think in the New York Times, where she is being targeted for being kind of patient zero for COVID-19, which is 100% disinformation. But she's being significantly harassed. So Mike, asked, should our nation reestablish the U.S. Information Agency to coordinate a more robust, coordinated approach to addressing disinformation? I am 100% yes on that. In the military, we talk about elements of national power, and we talk about four of them, and we call it DIME: domestic, informational, military, and economic. For the D, the M, and the E, we have a national executive agency or two that are responsible for those. Domestic, you think State Department; military, the Department of Defense; and economic is really between a couple agencies. But we have a lead executive agent in charge of it. With information, USIA was that lead executive agent, and it's now been parsed down mainly to the State Department, but it's been pushed out to other agencies. But there is no one executive agent responsible for information. Part of that is, like I said, after USSR fell apart, their primary role was combating information with respect to USSR. Once USSR collapsed, it was a cost savings measure. We didn't see that we needed it anymore. We won the fight. However, after the USSR collapsed, the information game from Russia actually amplified. It increased because it was low cost, maintain authoritarian control of the government, things like that. It continued. So yes, we need a national level executive agent responsible for coordinating our fight against disinformation. We do need a USIA, and we just don't have it right now. And if anyone would like to dialogue or anything, honestly, open up your mic, and I'm fine with that. Just cut in. How do you think Russia and China are using social media, Facebook, to sow confusion? 2016, the national election coverage of 2016, or the disinformation campaign that we saw there, there's a lot of literature out there, and you can research it. The bottom line, the approach, and I'm staying apolitical here, but depending on where you are on the political spectrum, it determines on how you perceive Russia meddling in the election. The information suggests that Russia's goal was to sow confusion, not to necessarily pick a winner. So we saw disinformation campaigns from Russia on both sides of the political spectrum. It might have been a 60-40 split, 60 right, 40 left, or something. So may have been more on the right side, showing the current president as their favored candidate. That may be the purpose, was to separate the country. If they can sow division, that's their goal. The more we compete with ourselves internally, the less we're competing with them. Actually, what's really interesting is the majority of their work was on Instagram and not Facebook. We often talk Facebook and Twitter, but they actually trafficked more disinformation on Instagram than Facebook by a significant margin. Now Facebook owns Instagram. It's maybe a moot point, but the idea of using visual memes that easily get shared. How disinformation works on social media is we all come with confirmation bias. We tend to, if we believe something, we find those things that reinforce our bias. And so those types of approaches are very good on social media, which is how things get shared. Overall, the amount of disinformation coming from Russia in 2016 was actually not that significant. The issue with disinformation from Russia is there's no timetable for it. It is constant. It's never ending. It's unending. It's about just sowing confusion and dissension. It's not about achieving a political win or something.
So Brian, let me jump in there real quick. Dean Martinelli is asking a question here that kind of feeds in along that line, and she's wanting to know what we're doing to help ensure the integrity of the 2020 election. In terms of the political disinformation. What do you think we're doing there?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's two primary agencies, three, I guess, responsible for this, and depending on the law, depending on how we which parts of the law we're looking at. So the Department of Defense is one of them. They have some requirements by law. Homeland Defense is another, and the Justice Department is another. Our lead organization in the Department of Defense is U.S. Cyber Command, which we set up recently, and they have legal authorities depending on what we're looking at. Homeland Defense does as well, and Justice Department. They all work very closely together. Without getting into classified material, I can tell you that from the Department of Defense side, U.S. Cyber Command is very focused on any type of activities that may interfere with elections and that kind of thing. So this is kind of a three-part thing, depending on which agency you're looking at. Department of Defense is not the lead. However, we do have a lot of muscle, and we can collaborate with other agencies. So I've only talked about this morning about disinformation, but there's a whole other cyber element to this that I haven't discussed. And so there is actually a lot of muscle behind securing elections. And I know the federal government is also working very closely with state governments as well.
So along that line, do you think that there's a disinformation campaign ongoing to discredit our various means of voting, whether it's
Absolutely.
online or by mail, vice in person?
Yes, absolutely. You, uh, if you, understanding that it's, and I'm specifically talking Russia, not China, but Russia's approach is to sow confusion, dissatisfaction, lack of confidence in systems and the government. So disunity among politically minded people. If there is a place where they can do that, they will. And confidence in state elections and the ability to secure elections and things like that, they are absolutely involved in that. Something an area where I think the private sector could do much more, and they've started. If you go on YouTube, you'll see, if you go on RT, Russia Today on YouTube, you'll see a disclaimer on there. It didn't exist about a year ago, that says that they're state funded by the government of Russia. That's a good step in the right, that's a good first step. But we need a lot more from the private sector, social media companies. And I'm not saying to decide what content is online. I'm saying to put those types of disclaimers on that information so that you see what the source of it is. I saw recently that Facebook is actually looking to kind of quasi geotag information to show you the source of the information. The thing with social media is you just scroll through and you see it, confirmation bias takes hold, and you just believe it and you share it. Hardly anyone goes and actually verifies that information because it takes many steps, and that's not what we do. So where social medias can really help is put that step in there for them automatically. So when you're scrolling, you automatically see the legitimate source of that information.
Yeah, it's a great point. How do you suggest we go about combating the trust in our social media platforms? I think there's a challenge there when we look at Facebook and goes, the common saying is, well, if it's on Facebook, it's true.
Right.
Right. But we all know that that's not the case. And of
Yeah.
course, it varies by region of the country and even within our communities and certainly around the world.
Yeah.
There.
There's a couple things. One I talked about a little bit earlier is as a nation, our public education system, we must incorporate information hygiene into our teaching. So we need to teach our kids at a very early age how to be discerning in information. We do it at the PhD and the master's program level of going to original source material and things like that. That type of thing needs to be learned at a much younger age. That one of the approaches for countering disinformation, it's actually inoculation. It's inoculate. You look at it as a virus and you inoculate. And the way you inoculate is having an educated public, specifically discerning of information. Um, it is very encouraging that the studies are showing our younger generations are more discerning and more skeptical of information than our older generation. That's very good. But when you look at the graphic of polarization in our country, where 30 years ago we were like this, there was lots of overlap. Now there's almost no overlap at all between ideologies politically. And that is a significant problem if we're going to counter disinformation. This, left and right, this is confirmation bias. So you've got the spectrum of people you have in our country. You have the ones on the edges, the fringe. Those minds aren't going to be changed. They are firmly rooted in confirmation bias. Where you can have significant effect is that middle 80%. But I do think if we actually got this type of education into our system of being discerning about information sourcing, I think that can have a significant effect. I don't think it's necessarily on the Facebooks and YouTubes can definitely help with that. I don't think it's their responsibility. We have to inoculate for disinformation. When you look at some of the Eastern European countries that have been actively fighting Russian disinformation because it's existential for them, they actually have night news broadcasts where they have an entire segment dedicated to, here's the latest disinformation from Russia today is this. We're not there yet in the United States. And I don't know if we will be there because of our polarization.
So Brian, here's a good question from Eileen. She's wanting to know, are we seeing misinformation spread only in posts, or should be wary of comments as well?
Yeah. So in Russia and China, it's interesting that we're seeing China adopt a lot of Russia techniques. The primary Russia way about doing this is they use troll farms, hordes and hordes of people who are paid, kind of think of it as piecework. They're paid by the post type of thing for sharing and creating fresh, new disinformation content, and they get paid by the post. Well, they also have profiles that are fake. They're out there commenting and discussing and things like that. China is adopting that same thing. And if you look at a country of 1.4 billion, people, they're 5, 6, 7 times the size of the United States, and they can set up entire troll farms to push this type of content. Additionally, internally, the control of information inside China allows them to, control dissent. So there is no dissent in China. It's very well controlled. Externally, they can spread this disinformation easily.
Yeah, great information there. Now Mary's asking about information hygiene and commenting that it's a new term for her. Certainly different than information or media literacy. And then she asks, so it sounds more behavior-based than knowledge-based, where people are actively practicing. What do you think about that?
Yes. Absolutely. I think we all have friends that you can kind of apply that to in terms of the behavior modeling and things like that. Yes. Information hygiene, I kind of made that up. But it applies with, we have cyber hygiene, which is similar. So the idea is the same. Media literacy, information literacy, it's all in the same family. It's really just it's no different than having a good diet. If you're being cautious what you're consuming physically, the food you're eating, you have to do the same with the information you're consuming.
Yeah, so along that same line then, when you mentioned about standing up a USIS type organization to counter, the Russian and Chinese disinformation and others, how does that all link together with what we're doing with U.S. Cyber Command and
Yeah.
other aspects within DoD, and then with our other federal agencies, and then certainly how we're partnering with corporate and private
Yeah.
organizations to build that defense.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about the United States is that it's different in terms of information than any other country in the world. Really, it's really rooted in our Constitution, our First Amendment. Our When you look at other armies, even the UK, they do not separate propaganda from public affairs information. To them, it's all the same thing. So we don't separate those things. When you look at military information related capabilities, you think, I'm not using the current terms, but think military deception, psychological, um, you know, um, military information support operations, propaganda. It's on a scale from black to white. So, I'm a public affairs officer. I kind of operate in the white information space, but we have capabilities that go all the way to the black information space. Other countries, they don't see a separation between propaganda, which would be gray, and public affairs, which would be white. It's all the same to them. So when you look at the Department of Defense, can you what was the second part of your question?
So getting into how from a government perspective, so
Yeah,
all of our federal
yeah,
partners outside of DoD, but within DoD and U.S. Cyber Command, with all of our
yeah,
intelligence agencies, and then with corporate and private organizations getting
yeah.
involved. And since this is hosted by higher education and West Virginia University, how are we utilizing our education partners to develop strategies or a defense?
Yeah. We are rightfully so very constrained by laws with respect to how we do information. So we don't do propaganda against an American, for example. And in the information space today, that gets very, very tricky because information is borderless. You can consume it anywhere. So we're very restricted with our authorities on how we can do information operations. So public affairs officers, they can tell what we deem to be the truth all day long. It's providing information. Other types of information operations requires a lot of authorities. So in Syria, combating ISIS, we had very specific authorities for when we could lie, so to speak. And we did that, and we did it very well. And we have a lot of capabilities to be able to do those things. So when you move to the the government private part, there is actually a lot of cooperation between at least the Department of Defense and social media companies. I can't speak for the U.S. government, but I believe that to be the case. But the Department of Defense is lashed up pretty well with social media companies. We collaborate. The private companies are going to do what they're going to do. And the U.S. government is going to do what's going to do. It's not exerting influence on them, but we're collaborating and sharing. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
You did, in a roundabout way. Do you see the one thing you really didn't touch on, though? Do you see a way that that higher education can play a role in this
Oh yeah,
process? And I think about, for example,
yes,
you're a graduate of the Defense Information School at Fort Meade. I'm sure that they provide this in their training curriculum.
yeah.
Is there a way that we can partner from a higher education perspective to develop those opportunities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. When I went through college, Dickinson College here in Carlisle a long time ago, you have your basic courses you have to take, and you have your like introduction to college type courses you have to take. That's a huge opportunity for like West Virginia University and other colleges to to kind of put in there some curriculum on information, being skeptical on information. I mean, that will serve them the rest of their lives, especially their academic career, of being discerning of information. In the academic environment, I think we tend to focus on, you know, go to the original source, that kind of thing. I think that needs to be broadened to, hey, you need to be aware of what you're consuming if you want to be you know, a real thinker and an academic. You really have to be concerned about what you're consuming. I think there's a ton that colleges can do in that respect. However, I think that needs to happen at a much younger age. I still think that has to happen when they're 5 years old.
Great point. And as you mentioned earlier, I think that there's a lot to be said for the younger generation,
Yeah.
not to age any of us, and their awareness of the digital world compared to the older generation,
Yeah.
and especially those that are much more senior, and their aptitude to not only engage in the digital world, but once they do, to quickly accept that 15 second blip of information or headline that goes across their
Right.
screen and becomes a thumb stop.
Yeah.
There's another question out here. It says, Jasper's asking if you could address the role of the Epic Times, which has been very active around YouTube documentaries. It claims to be fact-based and unbiased, but peddles conspiracy theories and a Falun Gong agenda.
um, so I'm familiar with Epoch Times. And again, these are my personal views. I don't represent the Department of Defense in this respect. That's why I'm wearing this collared shirt. But I don't consume the Epoch Times. I have seen those comments. So I don't want to make a judgment on a specific outlet. There are, you can Google it. I don't have it available right now, but you can Google it, and there are graphics out there that kind of show where news organizations land on the spectrum from left to right politically, to and then how newsworthy they are, how you know, the quality of their work is, and you want to kind of hit that center where everything crosses. That's kind of where you want to hit. I'll just say Epoch Times is not kind of in that center. So it's, but again, in my opinion, it's okay to consume that information. You just have to understand what you're consuming. So, you know, if you want to go eat a cheeseburger, it's okay to go eat a cheeseburger, but you got to understand, you know, what that is. There are news sites, and I wish I had the link right in front of me, but there's a news site that will have, for one story, one narrative, one topic, they'll have 3 stories, left, right, center. And they using their judgment, they will find a story that's classically left, classically right, and then right down the middle. And you can read all 3 stories side by side. That's a great exercise in understanding how stories are framed and that kind of thing. But all of these sites are designed to get you to click so that they can get ad dollars and they can make a paycheck. I mean, that's just the way it is.
Absolutely. Business. So along that thought then, how do you go about monitoring the vast array of media outlets, particularly as an Army public affairs officer?
Okay.
And you know, for example, your prior job was working for the Chief Staff of the Army. In that role, obviously, the Army is in the news all day, every day, not just in the United States, but globally. How do you all uh, how do you capture and monitor all that information and identify what's important and what's not important?
Yeah, that's a good question. From an Army public affairs guy perspective, um, what's most important to me is the life cycle of a story or a narrative. Is it gaining traction? Is it veering off from accurate? or is it becoming more accurate? So you hear the term second day story, a second day story, or a third day story. Something happens, say a crisis happens. Day one is, here are the facts of the crisis. This is, a tornado went through this town and killed this many people. A day two story, you'll start to see some type of information agenda. One way or the other. You'll still have those news organizations that are staying right there with the news, but then you'll see people trying to take advantage of it. This is someone's fault, or someone could have done something to prevent it. And then day three story, and it just keeps, so the story starts here, but then, they veer off in all directions. From my perspective, I try to understand where the story is and where correction needs to happen. The issue is, honestly, the first person with the story wins they dominate the environment. So it's kind of like ownership is 9/10 of the law. If Russia gets in and takes Crimea before Europe figures out what happened, guess what? They have Crimea. It doesn't matter if they were wrong. Information's the same way. If you can take that territory first, you have a significant advantage of keeping that territory. And from a government perspective, a DoD perspective, we do not do a good job of seizing territory. Maybe we shouldn't be, but the problem is we allow disinformation to take root, and to me, that's a big problem.
Gotcha. It's we're getting close to time on hitting the 1 hour mark, but kind of want to shift gears just slightly. In West Virginia, Secretary of State Mac Warner, working with his team, has really been aggressive in developing online voting, and particularly in support of our military personnel deployed around the world so that they have the ability to vote. You and I both know, having been deployed in very austere locations, the challenges that we face there.
Yeah.
A previous person listening in asked about the concerns regarding PII, personal identifying information,
Yeah.
and the security of that, and particularly with the COVID situation and identifying people who have tested positive, etc. Do you see a challenge there with the media and how we protect that information? And then it's kind of more on the cyber side, which really isn't your lane, but kind of related. Do you think there's risk involved in how we set up these online systems to support, our supposed new way of life?
Yeah. So elections are a great topic with respect to disinformation, because it's one of those things where it's very polarized. So it's and we collectively, all states collectively, have not had a good track record of being able to secure elections and information and things like that. Elections are a state issue, not a federal issue necessarily, but states run elections, local governments run elections. And even recently with the primary, the Democratic primary, we've seen a disaster at the beginning of it with how using technology can fail. So what I'm getting at is, people are not comfortable with the information in the information space. People are not confident in the system. There is not confidence in the system of securing information in elections and things like that. You apply disinformation techniques from Russia, that's exactly what they want. So they're going to keep pushing, hey, you can't be securing your elections. So in terms of protecting information, it's critical. These local governments and state governments must be focused on instilling confidence in the system. So to me, it's more about instilling confidence in the system than it is about protecting the data. They can protect the data. The more we go automated, there is a strong concern by cyber folks that those things can be hacked and things like that. we live in a digital age. It has to go that way. So from an information protection point, we will eventually have all digital voting. It's just a matter of time. Many places are doing it now, and there are ways to protect data. They have to get there. The first part is you're not going to get there until you instill confidence in the system. In terms of managing risk, from what I've seen, voter fraud is always a topic of discussion, but it's never a game-changing issue. But I don't think we'll get there until we kind of secure the narrative around information security with respect to elections.
Yeah, so information operations obviously is a big part of this, and how we make ourselves feel more secure in this environment. So, it's kind of like we used to get our paychecks handed to us, and Brian, I don't think you're as dated as I am in the military, but we used to go through a pay line and actually have a pay officer who gave us cash. Today, it's all digital, ETF, electronic funds, or EFTs, electronic fund transfer, and all that kind of stuff to our banks. But yet we still have people in America who think that they literally need to go to the bank to do banking. I think the same thing parlays to our voting systems and everything in between. It comes down to a matter of trust and the information that we're provided. And certainly, so the media has a big role to play there in how we are comfortable with that environment. But from a DoD perspective, and certainly an Army perspective, I know from my background in representing the Army in the past, we are an extremely apolitical organization. How does the Army and DoD work to train you and guide you through that process so that you know your left and right limits on what you can and can't say?
Yeah. For a public affairs officer, just kind of half making a joke, but you can make one mistake and then you're not going to be a spokesperson anymore. So one is it's a bit existential for a PAO to go out in front of a camera and say something. We represent the organization, so in a professional capacity, I speak for the organization. I speak for the Department of the Army. We are guided by laws and doctrine and regulations about what we can say and things like that. But our purpose is to provide truthful information. As a PAO, my job is to provide truthful information. Some people get into a debate about influence. Well, anything you put out is influence. I think when you apply context to information, you're now kind of influencing, but I think it's still important to provide that context. Why are you buying that F-35? And so don't just say you're buying the F-35, explain why you're buying the F-35. Once you get into other information operations, down to psychological operations and other things, then you're getting into gray and black areas that are very restricted. But the Army Public Affairs Officer can pretty much go out and talk about any topic because the point is to provide truthful information. I'm fairly comfortable with the training we get at the Defense Information School, and our conduct. Most of the issues we have is when a commander not trained kind of gets in front of his skis and gets in trouble. But you don't see that often with public affairs officers. I think we're pretty well trained. And I see Mary in the chat. I don't know if she's still online. And so for Jasper, I would love to connect you with Mary O'Shea. She's at the Defense Information School, and I think that would be a great lash up for some of those resources for helping teach this topic.
Yeah, Brian, thanks so much.
Yeah.
And that gives us about an hour. We appreciate you sharing your wisdom and experience and thoughts with us. It's disappointing we weren't able to get Colonel Jackson on board.
Yeah, it's okay.
But the technical challenges didn't support his situation today, and hopefully we'll be able to get him back another time. But Brian, your information again that you shared with us has been extremely informative, and we appreciate it very much. To all of you listening in, thanks again for joining us for today's chat. We invite you to visit integrate.wvu.edu so you can sign up to be notified about future events, and you can see other things that are upcoming. But again, thank you all so much for joining in. And Brian, once again, thanks for your service to our nation. It's just a little bit of a side note. Brian and I served together in Iraq back in 2007, 8, 9 time frame with the 18th Airborne Corps during Operation Iraqi Freedom. And I got to know Brian there quite well and see him in action as a younger, more junior officer, but supporting a very, very critical mission with both General Petraeus, General Odierno, General Austin, and a lot of other senior leaders, and nothing but a true professional in everything that he did. And so when you talk about Brian making that one slip up and being fired, obviously you're still batting 1,000 because you continue to do well and progress in your career. And obviously, by evidence of your last position working for the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Milley, who's now our Secretary of Defense, kudos to you on a job well done. And again, thank you for your service to our country and what you continue to do. And again, to everyone listening online, thank you so much for joining in today. We appreciate having you.
Thank you.